Good evening, everybody. We're going to get ready to get started here in a minute. I want to touch base with you one last time. This would be a time to adjust your audio so that you can hear okay and everything. Looks like we have our sites have joined. There may be one or so that is still trying to get in, so we're going to give them another minute here. But we will be starting our session shortly. It is 7 p.m. So let's start with this evening. I apologize for not introducing myself earlier. I'm Robert Barton. I'm going to be the host this evening. I'm a professor here in Extension at North Carolina State University, and am moderating, as I said, tonight's session. With tonight's session, a real quick rundown on the agenda. For a few minutes here, we are going to, I'm going to bring up a slide with a few statements on it. And the purpose of these statements are for you to discuss amongst yourselves as peers, to talk a little bit about what the subject matter is tonight and to get you thinking on the topic before the speakers engage with you in the presentation. Your site host will help try to facilitate that with you, and then they're going to type in some responses that they're hearing from you back into our chat window so that we can see how you guys are responding to these questions. And with that, I'm going to move into that here in a second. After the statements, we will then do our presentations. We have 3 speakers this evening, and I'll introduce them right before we start the presentation. And then about 8 o'clock, we'll go into a short break, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. We're going to ask that from a question and answer standpoint, will you enter your questions into the Q&A feature here of Zoom, and you can see it there in your menu. So, and with that, we're going to now move into the statements. And as I said, site host, if you can help facilitate these statements, take about 10 minutes to do this at this time. So folks, I hope it's going well for you and everything. We got a couple more minutes. Just want to make sure to let you know that we are reading the chat windows and seeing things come in. We have comments about are people making money through managed forestry? What are the markets like? Each practice needs to be researched and tested. One group says it's best to check around, and selective cutting is the way to go. If the markets is down, wait as long as there isn't going bad. Markets are very local, while market trends can be more generalized. So good discussions going on out there. I'm going to give you another minute or two, and then we will move into introducing our speakers. Here's a comment. The forestry market may be profitable if managed properly. I suspect that's true for all kinds of investments. Another comment about bad winter is good for markets. There's biological maturity and there's financial maturity. You have to balance the two. There's some real good comments coming in tonight, folks. So, and with that, I think things are kind of slowing down there. So we're going to move on in our presentation. And let me introduce our three speakers tonight. They're experts in all their work that they do related to forestry and forest economics. Our three presenters is Dr. Rajan Parajuli. Rajan is an assistant professor and extension specialist in forest economics with the Forestry Extension Program at NC State University. Dr. Parajuli specializes in economic impact and contribution analysis, forest product market modeling, alternative income streams, and timberland valuation. Dr. Mark McGallis. Mark is an extension professor of forestry with Forestry Extension here at NC State University also. Dr. McGallis specializes in forest management, taxation, and conservation strategies. And then to spread the knowledge, we've reached out and asked Dr. Sean Tanger to present for us tonight. Sean is the assistant professor and extension specialist at the Coastal Research and Extension Center at Mississippi State University. Dr. Tanner works in the area of timber markets, invasive species, taxes, managing timber stands, and economic contributions of forestry to the Southeast United States. And with that, we're going to turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. McGallis.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Bob. If you all see my screen, I want to just talk about what we'll talk about tonight. So I just have a few slides and want to get you started on the topic, and then we'll return to our two economists to explain the nitty gritty. But that first question we talked about is forestry a competitive investment? We will get into those numbers directly in the next few slides. So it's going to depend, again, on what kind of investment, the quality of your land, where you're located. But by and large, it's a competitive thing. It has been in the South. Your returns are going to vary, though, and a lot of that's going to be based on the decisions you make on the property. Are you an intensive manager, putting a lot of costs in on the front end or along the way? That's a good strategy where the markets are strong and where you're on top of the management. The other approach is to step back a little and be more extensive. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about profitability, but Dr. Parajuli will get into it. And then Sean will talk more about the market, since that seems to be where folks are headed. So the first thing, reforestation in the South has been a strong long-term investment. Up until recently, it's been matching the rate of inflation and growing above the rate of inflation. That's been a little bit more stagnant, as some of the comments have related of late. Timberland investments more on the large scale by retirement groups and financial managers have returned rates in the 8 to almost 9% for the 14-year period below that you see. But let's look at the real numbers for the last few years. There's a lot on this chart. Let's start at the example of number 3, that green line in the middle. Those are timberland indices. And you can see since 2014 and through the end of last year, the returns are fairly strong for timberland. The line above that relates to real estate investment trusts. So they're not just dealing in timberland, but the dealing of money, not money, but real estate transactions. So some of their money are in peak sales years when they're selling large tracts of land. The uppermost S&P 500 is an index that you typically hear. And you can see that there have been great years like 2019 where it's in the double digits, approaching 21%. 5 years prior to that, it was still in double digits, but only at half the rate. And then you'll see in 15 and 18, we've had some negative rates. So the one thing true to timberland is that markets go up and down, but if you're managing your trees, they're going to grow biologically, even when the price is down. And so that's a part of the investment strategy many folks have used, and it's an appealing part of timber because of its ability to do well even in down market times. So the big producers will have money in the stock market, but they'll also hedge their bets or minimize some of the risks by being in timber. Okay, enough numbers for a little while. I'm going to show you some graphs to let you see what some of the returns can be. So let's start with that line. The green bars show you that the more you invest, the potential for returns are greater, at least in terms of your net present value. We'll discuss net present value about 3 or 4 times during the talk tonight, so you'll get that. But if you read the right-hand side of the screen, that's the return on investment. What is your money returning at these various rates? And what I'd like you to take home from this graph, the least amount of investment actually has the potential in this example to return the most to the capital, an 11% return. So the take home from here, at least this slide, and maybe for some of tonight's lessons, are to be a good enough producer, manage the property that you have, but keep an eye on costs. Because you can see across the chart, when we double or really quadruple the investment, our returns can actually decrease on the money we've spent. So you have other things to do with your money and other investments other than timber. So it's very smart to be on the conservative side in many cases. So that was pine example. We want to show you the equivalence with hardwoods. And hardwoods, you see the net present value returns are slightly lower than pine management. And our investment returns, you can see, are in the double digits across the mountains, Piedmont, and coastal. And the rate of those returns are really more site dependent, because in this example, we're just letting Mother Nature reseed the forest. So we're using natural regeneration. The trees come up on their own. And the various differences in those investments are related then to the power or the quality of the soil that we're growing on. So 50-year rotations versus the previous example that were 30 years. And then our interest rate It's a little lower, 4%. That's what we call the capital rate or the cost of capital. Couple more slides. So from a big picture standpoint, we're going to introduce a few terms about the value of dollars, or how money grows over time, just from the investment standpoint. You're borrowing money at a certain rate from the bank, or that rate is set by an alternative investment where you could put the money. So many of us were raised on passbook accounts or bank accounts. My local credit union has been running 2% on the money, at least returns back to me. They may loan that same money to other members and ask for 4 or 5 or 6% on that interest, but they're paying me for the right to store my money in their bank a couple of percentage points. Here's an example of how those dollars expand or grow over time. So if we can borrow money at 5% interest rate, $1 invested this year for a 30-year investment will grow almost 4.5 times in that 30-year time frame. So that's the value of the money, and we call that compounding. That interest compounds into the future. And so that $1 investment today, just on a cost basis or the interest basis, it's going to quadruple in value over that 30 years. So that's the green money going into the future. When we look at investment opportunities, we really need to be talking the same dollars. So they're either today's dollars, and that's the red line. We bring the future returns like a timber harvest. We're going to bring it back to today's dollars, because the green line on top is going to show you what you've invested in that stand and what that's going to cost you out into the future. When we get an estimated or actual harvest number, we're going to bring that back to the present. And then it's just a simple subtraction where we subtract away the expenses for planting or what have you against our future returns from timber harvest. So there's no equations here yet. I think Rajan or Dr. Parajuli will tell you those. So the big idea is we know today's cost about what we're doing, setting trees in the ground, and we're looking to a future dollars on what that return might be. And to do the simple math, we just have to discount future dollars to today and do the math on those. So those key concepts, again, discounting is taking that future payment or stream of payments from the future and bringing it back to today's dollars. The reverse of that, if you want to look at future returns and know what your investment is today, we can compound those numbers into the future. And that's bringing the present dollars to future time. So we'll try to be consistent in the next 30 or so slides. When you see that red line, you'll know we're coming from the future back to today. And then if we're using the green line, we're compounding or moving today's dollars into the future. We can do the math in either direction. It's a preference that most people have to use today's dollars because we know today's costs by and large. Okay, so there you will see quite a few equations coming up. But what I like to do, and this is something we stole from our friends in Georgia, is just to do all the math for you. And in this simple example, I want to show you, we're going to look at the present value of a future dollar. So a dollar we receive in 30 years, that first red box, is going to be worth about 1/3 in today's money. So that discounting backwards is going to reduce a future dollar to today's dollar. It would only amount to 30 cents. That's how we read that one. So that's kind of a number you may feel comfortable about, a 30-year rotation for pines. You can know that in the future, that future dollar will come back and be only about 30 cents of that value. So what does that mean? If we sell $1,000 of timber in year 30, it's going to discount back to $300 in the present day. So that means we can afford to spend up to $300 in the present day for $1,000 return. That's called a break even at 4%. In the bottom example, then, we're going to look at a 50-year rotation, hardwood, and look what those extra 20 years do to our discount rate. Every dollar in the future is now going to be a seventh in today's dollars. Put another way is that to break even, we need, as this example shows, we can go in the other direction and those same numbers are just inverted. That 50-year rotation, we need that any dollar we put in the ground to be 7 times more valuable in the future just to break even at 4%. Let me say that one last time with what's written down here. The 30-year rotation, let's think of another thing that we do with an investment for 30 years, and that's buying a house. If we buy a house at 4% interest, look at the green, dark green numbers, we're going to buy that house a little over 3 times. Or if the purchase price was $100,000, when all is said and done and we own that house, we'll have paid $324,000 for that house. That's the right to live in that house while we're paying it off. By the same token, at that same amount, if we get a 15-year mortgage on that house, then we'll be paying $180,000 for a $100,000 house. You see how that works? Hopefully that will get you started. We're going to change speakers and let Dr. Powerjuli take you through his exercise as soon as I stop sharing this. Thank you for your time. I'll be back at the question period.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everybody. So I'll continue pretty much where Mark just left and talk about the time value of money a little bit in detail. And I'll talk a little bit more about the net present value, that terminology just Mark mentioned, as a financial criteria used in decision making in forestry and other long-term investment. And I'll show some few examples, and I'll pass the torch to Dr. Sean Tanger. So it is already shown that forestry is a long-term investment. Mark showed that the trees not only grow biologically over the time, but also money you put in forest management activities should grow to cover up the cost you put together now. So, and most of the forestry practices we know, like site preparation, planting, the herbicide treatments, are often really expensive, and the landowners require that upfront cost to invest now, like Mark mentioned, but you need to wait several years down the road to get paid back from the thinning or the final harvest scenarios, or from final harvest revenues. So here is a one pine example, plantation example, just hypothetical numbers. Let's assume you spend $150 now in establishment cost and competition control of $50 at the edge too. Those are the costs, right? And some of the income streams as shown in the timeline just come from thinning at age of 15, the $500. But like Mark already showed, the discounting approach, that $500 you'll get in year 15 is less than half worth in today's dollar at 5% interest rate. Similarly, that $1,500 you'll get in year 30 from the final harvest will be much smaller in today's dollars. I'll show this example in detail a few moments later. So this is the kind of the simple pine plantation example, but if you have other income streams like hunting leases, pine straw in a longleaf plantation forest, the cash flow in this timeline will become more complicated. So Mark already introduced these terminologies. Pretty much future values and present values are well described in Mark's those two example tables. So another important factors here is interest rate. He already mentioned that, right? So interest rate, which is often termed discount rate, sometimes called hurdle rate, alternative rate of return, or even a cost of capital, is a powerful factor in the financial decision-making process. And definitely number of years, the length of investment period, like 30 years and 50 years, just Mark showed, always matters. So how flexible are you in terms of how much you can invest initially, what is your risk factor, the interest rate you select, and how long you can wait. These always impact the financial decision making in forestry and investment. And I think Son will go in detail how objectives of your woodland ownership and management impacts which direction you should go in terms of financial planning in your timberland. So as already mentioned, future value and present values to different time periods, right? So we can make equivalent of these $2 today with the value of the same dollars tomorrow using the concept of compounding and discounting. Mark already showed that. So in this example, the thinning revenue of 500 you are getting in year 15 is equivalent to $240.50 in today's dollar. That is at the interest rate of 5%. So that value is completely different if you use a different interest rate. I'll show you that in a few minutes. So here is the quick hardwood example, pretty much the hypothetical one. And in hardwood, we by and large don't do any early activities, right? Since we must rely on natural regeneration, and you already learned the hardwood versus pine plantation and management at the last week webinar. So in this example, I added a timber stand improvement, some brush clearing kind of stuff worth of $25 in year 35, just an example. And if you harvest in year 50, the value, let's suppose be 3,600 you'll get from the final harvest. So we all know that hardwood usually has a longer rotation and less or almost non-initial cost, unlike in pine management, which is usually capital intensive, the example I just showed before. So the interest rate, right? So we have been mentioning that interest rate several times. Mark also went through that. So it represents the cost of capital, the interest payment you need to make for your mortgage. So this works both ways, like Mark mentioned. It should capture the opportunity cost of your investment. For example, that means a benefit you could have received, but was given up to invest in forestry. For example, you could have invested that initial site prep cost in stock markets, but you invested in reforestation. By that, you give up your stock market returns, right? So in this example, you can see how crucial interest rate could be. For example, just a 1% higher interest rate from 4% to 5% in the same time period, the value, the dollars could grow 50% more, right? So $7 to $11.50 in 50 years. That's why we always bargain for lower interest rate in our home mortgage as well as the auto loan, right? So that's the crucial factor in this kind of a cash flow analysis. So net present value, which is often termed NPV, is one of the most commonly used financial criteria of any long-term projects like forestry. So it is just the net return in present dollars. We are bringing everything in today's time from the entire project period. So to calculate the NPV, first discount all the cost and revenues back to year zero, the current period, using the discounting formula, and then subtract the cost from the revenue because we are getting the net revenue, net present revenue. So the decision rule is if NPV is positive, that means at least 0 or greater than 0, the project is acceptable. That means it is profitable and you should invest in that project. So one important step in NPV calculation is bring all the cost and revenues from entire cash flow timeline back to the current period. So we'll not focus on the much of the calculations and the maths here, just try to understand the concept. So this is the one of the most commonly used financial criteria in long-term investment analysis. So here is the example, pretty much the same pine example, and I showed before. So we are discounting both thinning income of $500 and the final harvest of $1,500 back to year zero, and everything in the today's dollars. Similarly, the competition control is also discounting back to year zero. And then and sum it up, all the cost and the revenues in today's dollar, and subtract the cost from the revenues, right? So in the above example, the present value of cost is just $195 in current dollars. And the revenue, even if it looks like you are getting 500 and 1,500 from your thinning and final harvest, in the today's dollars just sums up less than $590, right? This is 3 times less than the value you receive in year 15 and year 30. So the NPV is just the $392 per acre. It is positive. So that means investment is profitable and worthy of investment. So positive NPV means always go. So similarly, the hardwood example I just showed before, right? So the cost, you see, if you brought that cost back to the from the year 35, it will just be $4.53 now, and that 3,600 you are receiving in year 50. If you're bringing that back to the current period, it's just $314 in today's dollar. So the NPV in this in hardwood cash flow analysis is still positive, $309 per acre. That means positive, and it is the profitable investment. So this is how we make the decision in forestry. The higher the NPV, and positive NPV is always better. And now the relatively earlier returns are better as they're worth more in current dollars. You already saw that 30 versus the 50 years rotation. So we learned positive NPV is always good. So how about the negative NPV? That means when your present value of costs is higher than your present value of revenue, what will you do? So the negative NPV doesn't necessarily mean you immediately kill the investment. Several factors are crucial in this kind of cash flow analysis. Sean will explain it, those factors in detail, but one of the important factors is interest rate. I already mentioned, right, that I use in the analysis. For example, look at this table, how the NPV varies widely with the different discount rate, right? So when you have the higher interest rate, you can see how quickly the NPV started declining. So the same cash flow is positive with the 2% interest rate and 8% interest rate, 10% interest rate, but it is negative now in 12%. So the higher the interest rate, the lower the NPV, because the dollar value you are trying to invest now is more valuable. So that means your dollar can earn that 12% somewhere else, right? So let's do the same pine example with a different interest rate. Before I showed that positive NPV with the 5% interest rate, let's suppose you have the 12% interest rate in place of 5%. In this scenario, forestry investment is not a good financial decision, right? Because you have a negative NPV. That means your dollar has a good value. So invest your money where you get that 12% interest in your dollar. In other words, if you are taking loan with 12% interest rate to invest in your forestry, that's not a good idea. You'll lose money. So before I turn it over to Sean, here is some financial consideration. Its activities should have financial implications. We have, I think, second bullet point, the discussion point before. So we apply this time value of money concept in evaluating any financial consideration in forestry. I think there was a question or two about it in last week's presentation as well. So each and every activity you implement, including site prep, bedding, fertilization, pre-commercial thinning, you name it, should make sense financially. Here is the one example of fertilization I would like to highlight. So if fertilization cost like $100 now, $100 per acre, you plan to apply fertilizer right after your thinning, and suppose the final harvest is 10 years away, you should have at least 163 worth of additional value that year 30, right? The $163 worth of additional value pretty much through the additional timber growth, right? Because of that, the response from the fertilization, just to cover your $100 investment now. That means if the value won't be at least $163 in year 30 or 10 years down the road, no point of applying fertilizers. You know, you can apply this concept in each and every activity and applications. So with this, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Sean Tanger. Sean, let me stop sharing my screen so that you can jump in. Thank you all, and we'll be back during the Q&As again. Sean, take it over.
Okay, can everyone see my screen there? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Rajan. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to try to speak in a little more non-economist terms and phrases, because I realize for forest landowners, a lot of this material really seems like a foreign language. They're already trying to master and grasp concepts with biology and management, and then we start throwing a bunch of econ buzzwords at you, and we do that so that we can keep high-paying jobs and keep everybody needing us for extension and outreach. I'm going to go over some of the key assumptions that go into the formulas that Rajan and Mark were discussing earlier. So you've heard Rajan mentioning this concept of and Mark mentioned this concept of a discount cash flow model. So what we're really talking about there is merely just taking these costs and benefits that occur in the future and bringing them back to time now, so time zero or today. While you won't see objectives of your forest management in that formula, I think it's very important for us to discuss that initially before we get into the different factors that go into those types of discount cash flow equations. So really when you're discussing the objectives of your forest management strategies and plans, as a landowner, you're going to need to ask yourself, how long do I want to own this property? What do I want to own it for? And the reason you want to do that is that in order to maximize those objectives, if it's value that you want to get out of the forest, so financial return, what's for the particular site that I have, how long do I need to grow it? What practices do I need to implement to maximize tree production at an efficient cost to revenue stream in order to get that particular objective? Now, most forest landowners have multiple objectives. You need to understand, though, that you can't maximize more than one objective mathematically. So if you're going to manage for forest income as well as wildlife, well, now we're going to have to be willing to accept on that back end, when we're talking about our quantity of timber that we're going to be able to cut, we might have to mitigate our what we're looking for there, because we want to have the hunting opportunities throughout the life of that stand. But many of you own the property for retirement or to send kids to school or to pay off a house, at some point. So in that way, economists will use these formulas to try to find, okay, based on all these different factors that we're going to talk about here in these key assumptions, what's the optimal rotation age? You always hear economists talk about that when it comes to forest management. You as a landowner may not be interested in what that optimal rotation age is. You may be optimizing based on, I've got to cut these trees in 30 years. What do I need to do to maximize the growth into that 30 years? The great thing about the formula, it's flexible, so you can do all of those things, and you can try some different strategies and see how they flesh out relative to one another. So the first and most important thing when you're talking about a discount cash flow model is your discount rate. A discount rate, so you heard the term earlier, interest rate. Specifically, what we're talking about is your cost of investing this capital in this particular investment. So if I can get 10% in an investment that's got no more risk or no less risk in it than this forest stand, then I need to at least get 10% in this stand. If I can get only 9% and I can get 10 elsewhere, then from a purely financial standpoint, I should take the 10% elsewhere. Okay. So typically in forestry, we're looking at a discount rate between 4 and 6%. Most examples, you'll see 5%. If you want kind of a benchmark for, at least for a pine managed stand, a benchmark for what the rate should be, you can use a 30-year treasury. And I think recently I was looking at that, they're around 3.5%. So that's the safest investment currently that you can invest in. So anything else, right, I need to get a higher return out of it because there's going to be more risk associated with those other investments as compared to that treasury bond that's going to be guaranteed by the government. So your discount rate factors in certain risk assumptions. And the riskier that project that you're going to be in, the higher the discount rate needs to be because there is that inherent possibility of losing maybe all or more often a portion of that particular investment due to some outside risk, either market forces or biological things like storm damage, etc. Okay, so next we're going to talk about timber prices. I know that's always a big issue for most landowners. When you're seeing revenues in those prior examples, what those are is simply an assumed timber price multiplied by an assumed timber quantity. So this really makes landowners nervous because we're doing two things here. We're both projecting what the quantity of timber is going to be based on the management strategy that we're implementing, and we're going to be guessing to a degree at what the prices are going to be. So it's really important when you're running through these to do what's called a sensitivity analysis, and you can talk with your consultant about that, where they run a bunch of scenarios for you so you can see how much variation there is in trying different strategies on a particular piece of property. If it ranges wildly, that should give you pause. If you're risk averse and you see that possibility that it can go in two very distinct directions, then maybe the timber management isn't right for you. For a pine stand, that's typically unlikely, and again, unless you get a catastrophic event like a hurricane or something like that. But in terms of what we expect for timber prices going forward, they're looking at for the next 10 years being pretty flat, but we do expect after that to start seeing significant movement as supply and demand start to equal out again. Next, your cost of practices, as Rajan was mentioning in his examples. You're going to carry a lot of these costs, particularly your establishment costs, for a long time. Even if it's a pine stand, you're basically carrying what looks to be a small cost for a 30-year period. So that weight of that cost gets larger and larger as more and more time goes out. So you need to hit a big return on your revenue streams from your timber harvest in order to offset them. So are the practices actually worth it? Things like pre-commercial thinning or mid-rotation herbicide treatments. Again, that's going to be specific to your particular property based off the site quality, based off of what you're trying to do, and based off of what the market looks like in your area. Length of the rotation, again, as I said, this is important, but it's really dependent upon the species here, with some flexibility. Typically 30 years for pine, and anywhere from 45 on up to 65 or 70 if you're dealing with southern hardwood forest, and it could even be longer than that for some hardwood forests that are naturally regenerated. And lastly, we won't really touch on this much other than to say, in this equation, you can have an inflation on both your cost of practices and your timber prices, but they will apply, typically they would be applied equally to both. So to simplify the formula, you can just leave inflation completely out of the model, and you will end up with the same number that you, for your net present value, that you would if you induced or introduced inflation or left it out. Typically, I leave it out. It's just simpler to calculate. You can see some examples here. They look a little bit different than the ones you've seen earlier. We've got that similar 5% discount rate. We've chosen a rotation age of 30 years for some specific objective that we have. Annual cost, we've got here for $10 per year, and these include things like property tax, and if I've got a consultant that's going out and actively looking at things year to year to make sure there's not bug spots or too much fuel loading on the ground, things like that. So we do want to account for those. But then you have your very traditional pine plantation management regime here. What I really want to draw your attention to is we have a discount rate of 5%. That means we're saying we need to, we can get 5% or better, or we can get 5% elsewhere. So we need to get 5% on this investment. Did we get it after we've run all of these cash flows? Did we actually get the 5%? We can go down here and see that our net present value is positive. This means that we indeed did get at least 5%, and we got more than 5%. Anytime you see an MPV that's got a positive number, that is, you got 5% plus $60 in net present value per acre. So these are all on per acre bases as well. Now, it's a little bit confusing. You say, well, we get 5% plus the $60. Well, how many dollars would that be? Well, it's not, you can't really look at the formula that way. All it tells us is that we got the rate of return that we needed plus some more. Well, how much more if you want it in terms of a rate? You can see here this term, what we call the internal rate of return. We're not going to cover that in depth tonight, but those often are done together by consultants when they generate cash flow analyses for you. But it would actually show you, okay, based on that net present value, I returned 5.58% on that investment. One other point I'd like to make, and we have an oak timber example here, and I've really kind of gone really far in terms of the years. You can see here the net present value is $42.62. Now you might say, oh, well, this is $60, this is $42. Does that mean that the pine investment is better than the oak investment? And you cannot compare them. They're not on the same year regime. And so net present value, that's one of its weaknesses. You can't compare investments of different rotation ages. So there's actually another term that we won't get into tonight, but you need to be aware of it. It's called land expectation value. And it would put both of these on a perpetual regime. So if you wanted to compare two different ones like that on different time periods, you could do that. And it's just a little bit of a more sophistication on your discount cash flow formula. Anybody that's interested in learning more about that, you can contact any one of the three of us after this meeting's over with. So all those different things that are going into your assumptions, you need to have information on where, what are reasonable assumptions for some of those numbers. Those two examples I showed you earlier, if you want to run some of your own hypotheticals, you can go to the Timberland Decision Support System run by Texas A&M Forest Service and choose their Timberland Investment Calculator, and they have all the traditional costs and revenue streams that you would see on a traditional timber site, either pine or oak. In terms of cost of practices, I'm only aware of this one that's done in Mississippi. These are 2013 fees and services of consulting foresters. They're a little outdated, but it's the most recent one. It gives you some idea of how much the different consulting services might actually run you in terms of other practices. So things like herbicide or mechanical site prep. There's the cost and trends for southern forestry practices out of Auburn, and this is available online for free. You can contact Dr. Adam Maggard or Dr. Rebecca Barlow at Auburn University, or you can contact me and I can send you the link as well. Lastly, you need to have an idea of what prices are doing. And most states in the Southeast, I believe all of them, produce quarterly price reports by product class. Now, you got to keep in mind for all of these are all going to be done, at least these three here, this is all going to be done by survey. So we send out surveys to consultants or to people doing these practices or people reporting prices for products. Your specific site, these may not apply exactly. They should just be used as benchmarks, sort of guides for you to get an idea of how much roughly should these things cost. Okay, they're merely approximations. So financial considerations. First of all, we'll talk about on-site ones. Evaluate implications of each activity or practice before pursuing them. Now, when you originally write the management plan for your property and you lay out your objectives, that's when these will typically come into play. But you also want to be mindful as you're going along, as things around you are changing, either on the site or off the site. Maybe doing a pre-commercial thin would be too costly under different circumstances than what we had when we originally started the plan. And now we need to pivot, and I need to talk to my consultant or whoever my friend is that's helping me manage the stand in order to see, does this still make sense to do? And we can do that by rerunning our discount cash flow model to see, does it still make sense based on the new information we have or the new environment that we face. You also need to understand advantages and disadvantages of your property specifically. So when it comes to what I can expect on future returns, obviously the most important one is going to be, well, I say most important because with the logging operators now, with the economies of scale issues that we're having, the number of acres is really important. Now that depends on what they're doing, of course, and what species that they're removing from your property, but you need to be very mindful of, do I have enough acres to actually do the objectives that I'm trying to successfully manage for. And also the quality of your site, that's important. How do I, am I gonna put a bunch of herbicide and things on the ground if the quality of the site is so bad that it's really just throwing costs that aren't going to increase the quality of my trees very much or the growth rates of those trees. Some other financial considerations, cost share programs. So those costs up front, you can actually have them offset a bit by state or federal agencies. They have incentive programs. Typically, I have 60% here, but typically you see 50%. But if you're doing things like longleaf pine for establishment, you can get, in some cases, up to 90% cost share on those costs up front, which really, really helps boost up that net present value because you're knocking down those costs that you're going to carry over a long lifetime. Other tax considerations. Do you know what the basis is in your property? Do you know if you have long-term capital gains treatment? Or do you have short-term? Are you classified as a business or an investor or a personal landowner? All those things are important to find out because they're going to have big implications when you go to do a timber harvest and you have a say. Next, seek professional assistance. Talk is cheap. We work for the state. There's federal agents as well that are paid to help you guys make decisions. While those are important, nothing beats a consultant that's on the ground that works in your area. A lot of people will ask, should I hire a consultant or not? Many people will say, just like with selling a house, I'm going to do it myself. You do not want to do that. Unless you're a registered trained forester or you've been doing it for 20 or 30 years and you really understand things, you can really get into deep water really quick by trying to figure all this stuff on your own. It's good to have help. Again, why hire a forestry consultant just look at the numbers. They're paid on a commission basis typically, which means their incentives align with you. So the more money you get on sales, the more money they get. You want to look for a graduate forester. Typically, they're registered in most states, not all, but in most. And you want to learn from others' experiences. Go to your county forestry associations. Go to your forest landowner association meetings. Those will help you in terms of finding out things to avoid or things to look for. You can see here just some real quick data on whether or not it's worth it to actually hire a consultant. So if I sell my timber, if I hire you to help me sell my timber, is it going to be worth it? In almost all cases, we see a positive return either by product class, whether it be per unit sales or lump sum. So per unit's just pay as cut, really. They always look to pay off. Now, that doesn't mean every single person gets that benefit, but on average, there are positive returns. We can see that as well here, whether they be per unit sales, whether or not they're lump sum sales. We're looking at 11 to 12% in terms of improved returns. More importantly, they help you negotiate services. They help you find tax credits. They help you apply for other cost share. They set up your site prep if you're going to do a new rotation. All of those things help you get your taxes ready, establish your basis. They monitor timber harvests. So if you're worried about a logger, getting over on you, the consultant's there to help you avoid that. And they may use a performance bond to encourage compliance under the terms and conditions of that contract for that logger to execute those practices. Off-site financial considerations. Do you know what the mill specifications are at your nearby mills? So if you're going to grow sawtimber trees and you grow them up to 25 inches diameter breast height, so the size basically at your chest, are you growing them beyond what the mill specifications be? If they'll only take a 17-inch tree and yours are 25, you're going to have to scramble and find a mill that's further away that will take that wood. What about pine versus hardwood? What are the markets like either for pulpwood or for sawtimber in your particular area? Markets are so fragmented now, you see a lot of variation across the region in terms of what is a real strategy that I can employ. In some cases, you don't want to do any pulpwood specifically for hardwood because the prices are so bad and the mills, there's just no mills. So given that, are your objectives clear and realistic relative to other people's objectives who are going to take your timber? And lastly, you want to follow financial markets. Know what things are doing either that would affect timber or things that might be alternatives to being in timber. If you're purely looking at it as a financial opportunity, then maybe staying in timber is not the right thing for you. It's fine if it isn't. You're in this to make money. If you're in it for other things, then you take the bumps with it and you enjoy the scenery and the hunting activities and things like that. But those are still benefiting you, not in monetary ways necessarily, but in other ways that are still of value. Here's a good site, southerntimbersupply.com. You can put in your GPS coordinates of your property or a nearby location, and you can see all the different mills that are in that 50-mile, you can do a 100-mile radius. And then you can start to get an idea of, okay, well, if I'm going to grow sawtimber, what kind of sawmills are around? Are these hardwood or softwood? If you click on them and you go to the site, it'll tell you. It won't tell you the dimensions they take, but it'll give you the name and number of the mill, so you can call and find out yourself. So you can start to develop a plan based off of what's around you. So minding those surroundings is important. Well, finishing up here, if we're looking at a pine plantation or pine investment, we want to think about natural versus plantation. If you don't have a lot of cost a stomach for upfront cost, then maybe a natural regen operation is better for you. With the plantation, you're going to get a lot more consistent outcomes in terms of growth rates and returns. So there is that. This is a little more, there's a lot more variation, but it's a lot cheaper. This is going to be more consistent, but more costly. In terms of how long the life of the stand could be, anywhere from 23 on up to 40 years. Natural stand is certainly on the high end. Intensive plantation, closer to that low end. I say 23, that's more like a warehouser operation, but certainly for a small landowner, 30 years is definitely reasonable for pine, with a two thinning, a single thin and a final harvest. So you want to look at it like it's a long-term farming operation. They've really invested in genetics and things like that, so that pine is much more like growing corn for a long time as opposed to growing your hardwoods. Your initial cost, though, can cripple the investment for pine. They don't have as high a price return as hardwood saw timber, even though they come sooner. If you go too wild on your initial site prep cost, it can really undermine the life of that investment. Fire is cheap, but it's difficult to implement. It's really the best thing to be using to manage understory and keep nutrients regenerated in the soil, but it may not be realistic based on where you are, given there's a school nearby or a highway or something like that, or you just can't find anybody that's comfortable burning. Your returns are going to be far more certain than hardwoods. That's due to the research on growth and yield in terms of genetics, site specificity, and the response to genetics and fertilization on specific sites that's been done over the past half century. We've really gotten good at growing pine trees, and that's one reason why prices are depressed right now. So the markets are poor relatively, and they look to remain, what we see right now for about another decade. We're looking about 2028 to 2032 for most states in terms of what we would call peak supply. So after that, it looks to start tightening up a lot more. And pulpwood's very dependent on your specific market. Here in Louisiana and Mississippi, we're looking at $2 to $3 in some markets. You go east to the coast, over in North Carolina, and you might be getting $10 to $15 per ton. So it really varies based on your markets. Saw timber to a degree as well, but pulpwood more so. Hardwoods, much different from pine management. In fact, it's more, some would argue it's more art than science in terms of hardwoods, just because there hasn't been so much work done in terms of genetic selection and things like that. And companies haven't spent a lot of research and development dollars in order to maximize sort of growth potential on those stands. Excuse me. So you do see more natural stands. That's great. Hardwoods can have fantastic returns. You are going to have to wait quite a bit longer in most cases. You have these different return schemes. There's obviously going to be less initial cost. You want to be really careful if somebody is mentioning doing a hardwood plantation to you, because you're going to have to wait so long. Those costs are going to be carried forever. There's going to be more variation in those harvest returns as well. And given, as I go along in that stand, you're going to have to do some remediation as you go to select out laggard trees and things like that are still competing with your more quality saw timber, but they're not going to be very valuable necessarily to a logger. You may be able to do some pulpwood harvest, but you might have to go in and do some timber stand improvement vis-a-vis hack and squirt, things like that, to remove some of those poor competitors in the stand. Lastly, the markets for saw timber and hard timber are very resilient. They're doing fantastic compared to pine right now. And it looks to remain that way just because supply is so limited for hardwoods. In terms of pulpwood, though, we're seeing a structural movement away in our economy from the use of hardwood pulpwood, because the things that we use it for, pulping processes and things like that, we're just not using as much of that paper anymore that was the big user of it. Now we're in the age of the what I call the e-commerce, where the most pulpwood that's used is going to be pine pulpwood. Certainly there is still a place for hardwood, but we do see that it's much decreased over the last 10 to 20 years, and it looks to continue to decrease as time goes on. So finishing up, management objectives are always crucial. Whether they're realistic, knowing what they are, being very clear, and being willing to pivot, if things change around you, to sort of reset and figure out, okay, what do I want to do now if we're halfway through the stand and a mill's closed? Now what can I do in order to avoid that crunch maybe that I would feel otherwise? So knowing your surroundings and the capabilities of your property. What are my neighbors doing? Do I have collaboration with them in terms of making sure there's enough acreage, the capabilities of my property so that I don't overinvest in treatment effects. Know your allies, people like me in extension, state agencies and things like that, the CFAs, your neighbors, all those people are people you can go to for advice or information that you can share back and forth to get at better ideas. Before proceeding with any specific practices, evaluate whether they're going to be economically profitable, both at the front end of the investment and all throughout. You can keep doing a course correction to see, hey, does this thing still make sense for me to be doing this particular practice? You know, a non-site, know your local markets. So what are mills doing? What are their specs? Are they looking at, has the mill been laying off workers recently? Have they been adding and reinvesting in the mill? That's usually a really good signal. They're going to stick around for a long time, so you can be more sure of your investment. And lastly, seeking professional assistance, both the free kind, or I say free, but right, there's still an opportunity cost, and also the consultants. You're just better off the more people you talk with. This is an intensive thing to do, to manage a timber stand or timber property. It requires quite a bit of time. So while it can be a really good investment, it's only going to do as well as the time you and your person that you've hired to manage the land for you will put into it. And with that, I will hand it back over to Bob.
Thank you very much. And at this time, let me bring up my screen here for folks, and just to mention that the 2020 Woodland Stewart webinar series was actually it's created by a team of professionals. Some of us you've seen and heard from, such as from here at NC State Extension, but we also have people participating in helping with this from the University of Tennessee Extension, University of Kentucky Extension Program, the University of Georgia, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Clemson, and bringing this all together for us is our folks there in the Southern Regional Extension Forestry Program. So at this time, we're going to take a short break. We will start back up in about 7 minutes. As you come up with questions, I ask that you please type them into the Q&A feature of Zoom. You can do that by clicking on that. You'll see it down there in the menu. You should be able to see it. Click on that and type your questions in. And when we come back from break, our presenters will work through the questions and try to answer them. The goal is to wrap up here by 8:30 Eastern. So when we start back up in about 7 minutes, let's get ready to go. So thank you all. We'll take a break at this time. All right, everybody, going to ask you to come back and get ready to participate in the question and answer period. So I'm going to moderate, and then we'll have our presenters answer the questions for you. So far, we got several questions that have come in. So let's start with our first question. So let's start with why was the land property tax not included in the new present value evaluation tool? And why is the pine market poor for the next decade?
So I can answer the first part just for the simplification. So we have included everything, and we published one extension fact sheet here at NC State. I think I have already shared the link in the chat window that it's reforestation is still profitable kind of thing. In that example, we have laid out the 3 different scenarios with the 3 different site quality. Like if you have a low productive land, medium productive land, high productive land, and if you have like Mark showed that graph, it has like $100 investment, just plant and leave, and do a little bit of site prep activities with the $250 of your initial investment, or have a $450, do everything like the TMOs and those industry folks do. It's really costly, right? So we have laid out all those scenarios and showed the based on the current prices, how much the return will be. It is still about 8 to 11%, as much as I can recall now. So yeah, you can see that kind of thoroughly done example in one of our publications, recent publications.
And I'd like to add, in my examples that I showed you guys, where I showed the pine and the oak saw timber, or the oak investment, that $10 annually, that was inclusive of property tax. So if you go to the Timberland Decision Support System out of Texas A&M's Forest Service, you can actually plug in any typical annual cost or annual benefits. So if you have a hunting lease, you can put that in there, and it will calculate all of those things along with it. So typically you're looking for management costs inclusive of property taxes of around $10 per acre. That's most of what the literature says.
Okay. So the second part of that question, which other people have also chimed in with a similar question, is why is the pine market going to be poor for the next decade?
Yeah, if you don't mind, guys, I'll knock this one out.
Go ahead.
Really, it's a supply and demand issue. We incentivize people to plant a lot of trees back in the early and late 80s. And right as all those trees became saw timber mature, we had the biggest drop in housing that we'd seen in basically 70 years. So as there was no demand for those trees for a long time, the growth rates just outpaced the demand for the trees. They're closer now, so you do see more trees moving off the ground, but there's still that lag in price catching up with it. So the predictions are that it's going to take that long for demand to overtake harvest to overtake growth, and that's when you start seeing prices move up.
All right, thank you guys. An estimation for the markets for the next 10 years, what factors are you incorporating into your estimations?
So you want to take that, Sean, or you want me to take?
You can. I mean, I'm
okay,
happy
you
to.
can chime in. So,
Sure.
Pretty much the same, the supply and demand, like just Sean mentioned, but we are trying to see how much the demand is and how much the supply would be based on when tree grows, right? The pulpwood now could become like the short chippings in 5 years or 10 years and down the road. That kind of the tree grows at the same time. Then your demand also you can project like having the current mill uses versus what new is coming, like the CLT and things like that. So based on that projection only, still the demand and supply scenario analysis.
Yep, and most people don't realize we're actually producing more lumber than we were in 2005 and 6. So there's a couple of things going on there. One, the mills that are left are larger, so they have more market power. They utilize the logs that come into the mill better than they used to. And there is just an incredible amount of supply on the ground. You got to think a lot of these TMOs and REITs that have come on the scene in the early 90s, you know, they're growing a lot more trees, or at least tons per acre, than your typical landowner. So even on a per acre basis, there's more supply, and we just have to burn through it essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Mark, yeah, and like Mark also mentioned a couple of points, mills are become more efficient these days. They started using all the parts of the log, and their conversion ratio from log to lumber is it's quite high. That's the another point as well.
Okay, so next question that's come in is they're asking about fertilizing hardwood stands. Will that hurt the quality of the timber?
I have no idea. Son?
Hardwood management, I'm not very strong in, so I might have to punt that and get an answer from friends of mine. Mark may have some.
It should not affect it, especially on mature trees. You're going to increase growth rate. I guess the big question in pines, you can have a small growth ring and then expand to a big growth ring that could cause potential problems. But on hardwoods, I doubt that would be an issue.
Yeah.
Back to the economics question. So to recap what we've been saying all night is it's best to spend money just before you're receiving money from a harvest. So if that fertilizer is going to be in the last 2, 3, 4 years, it may be a moneymaker.
Yeah, and for the hardwood stands, if it's naturally regenerated, those first couple of years, you're going to have anywhere from 5, and I mean, I've seen as high as 20,000 trees per acre. Typically, it's not that high, but that could be a high watermark. And then after 2 or 3 years, they're going to start self-selecting out the stronger ones. They're going to basically push each other. So I'm not sure if you would even need the fertilizer at the front end. It's certainly everything's site specific, but you're going to have so many stems per acre initially that I'm not sure what good the fertilizer would do really.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. With e-commerce, you noted that the pulp market does not have a demand for paper, but cardboard demands would seem higher due to shipping increases. Do you expect to see this even out, or will the pulp market demand drop for predetermined reasons?
So relative to e-commerce, there is a glut in the recycled cardboard directly from the Amazon effect. So I'm sure the demand, at least for virgin fiber, would be good. I don't know many craft plants operating. I guess Sunoco is a big player in the cardboard boxes. They make the liner that is the actual corrugation between the two sandwich pieces. So that's really anybody's guess. I'll let the economists weigh in if they like.
Well, the demand for pine pulpwood, at least Rajan can pipe in if he has different thoughts, but that is bullish over the next bunch of years. But just like with saw timber, the price is greatly depressed because there's just a slog of trees on the ground. At least maybe not over on the eastern coast where they're sending pellets over to Europe, but certainly in Mississippi and Louisiana, those prices are depressed right now, even though harvest is pretty brisk.
Yeah, and some of the cheap mills, right? And they're taking some of the pulpwoods, and like Mark mentioned, the Son mentioned, some of the pellet mills, especially in the East Coast, there are the new demand, and some of the electricity wood burning mills, right? The energy mills, they are also utilizing some of the wood chips. These are the kind of the new markets in the pulpwood side.
Right, and also, you know, with even though the utilization of the sawmills for pine are really good, they're also producing more lumber than they ever have. So they're also a competitor for your raw pulpwood logs at the pulp mill with their, you know, their chips that they're creating or their residuals that get produced when they create lumber or plywood and things of that nature.
All right, on to our next question. This one is there any particular reason why you chose 4% and 5% in the examples?
So in my example, this is pretty much the common kind of the usual kind of assumption. So for example, if you see the 30-year mortgage rate, right? So pretty much it is 3, 4, 5% in that range. And when you are taking loan and pretty much your value of the cost, so since you are putting that money for the long term, so we are typically assuming that your alternative return would be that percent. Anything you want to add, Son?
Well, just that historically we see over a long history that we have nominal return rates of around 8% with an expectation of 3% inflation. And so once you net those out, you're at right about 5%. The reason 5% it's a lower number is because timber is historically and even currently considered a very safe and stable investment. So you know, if somebody's getting a 10 or 12% return on their trees, that's probably not going to last long because you've discovered something that everybody else is going to get in on, and because it's such a safe investment, they're going to drive that back down as they enter that marketplace. They're going to drive it back down to 5% again. So that's one. You know, it's kind of a complicated answer, but just to say it's a really safe investment. So it's just slightly over your 30-year treasury note, and you know, most people, if you get 5%, most other landowners should be getting 5% if they're doing the numbers correctly. If one landowner is getting a whole lot more than another one, that makes me scratch my head because it's a pretty competitive marketplace for you guys. So you should be getting pretty similar returns to each other.
Okay, let's go on to our next question. The average cost of site preparation and planting pines. Does anybody know that for Eastern North Carolina?
So we can weigh in on that. It really depends on the wetness of the site, how productive it is, how close to the coast it is. So each year, and I'm just about to do it for the present use tax rates for the state, we assume some standard practices. And as we get into the lower coastal plain and the tidewater area, site preparation costs can exceed $300 or $400. That's a rarity. Typical rates for most landowners are in that range that Rajan showed, and I showed in some of the earlier slides, from $100 to $250 per acre. That would be spraying and planting, or burning and planting, or just straight planting.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, and it depends, right? And North Carolina Forest Service especially has annual data, right, by their district, all the cost of all their practices. So if you would like to know specific, consider contacting them, or I might have those numbers too. I can provide.
Okay, there was a question earlier about the use of the cost of land in calculating investments. Why, when you do comparisons between different forestry investments, is land often not included in that calculation?
So in my examples, I assume that you already have your land. So what I'm doing is pretty much for the non-industrial private forest landowners, and I assume that you already have your own land. You are just thinking of what to do with that land. So I completely ignore that. But for example, those industrial like the TMOs and those investors, they have to account for those land value as well.
And you can include those in these formulas. It's just for simplicity's sake we don't. And of course, right, that cost initially on a per acre basis to purchase the land would decrease the return on that investment.
Yeah, it would completely change your return scenario if you add that the land value, the land cost. If you are renting, the land rent.
So one question here is, should I invest in a video camera to track loads of thin pines as they are an absentee landowner?
And my personal advice would be it's worth it to hire the consultant to do that for you. Be it for thinning tracks or final harvest or reforestation. If you're not there, they can act on your behalf. They have a thing called turnkey service. So it's all inclusive. So all the things that you would need based on your objectives. They usually take an 8 to 10, sometimes as high as 12% commission on any revenues. Well, not any revenues, but on harvests that you do. But all the evidence points that, on average, you bear out positive returns by using them. It's just like trying to sell a house without somebody who does it all the time, and you're basically competing with a real estate agent that buys and sells homes every day. They have an infinite amount more information than you do on that marketplace. So you need somebody in your corner that also has that information. It's worthwhile to pay for it.
Okay, comment that came in about the resources that were presented on slide 31. They were looking for information or links that are available. We will get those links that were mentioned in this evening's program. We'll get those together and put them up on forestrywebinars.net as well as on the Woodland Stewart webinars site for people that are interested to find those resources. So,
Bob, those resources are in the chat box too.
Yes, and they are in the chat box also, but give us a couple days and we will get them up on the web so that they're easy for you to get to. And then one last comment here was just to clarify, they were talking about two ends of interest, the cost on borrowed money and the expected return on the investment. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I know where the confusion is here. When I was talking about the discount rate and the internal rate of return, so your discount rate is a number that you select as being necessary to invest in this particular investment. And once you run through all the cash flows and assumptions that you have for that investment, it's going to kick out a net present value for you, which you can then use, and that Timberland Decision Support tool will kick it out for you. You could also kick out an internal rate of return on the investment. So what that's saying is, okay, given all those cash flows, what I actually got back out as a comparable number to that 5% was 5.51% in my oak timber example, for instance. Though they're not the same thing. One is specific, to that investment based off of the activities that occurred. The other one is based off of the opportunities that you could invest in other things, in other investment vehicles. That would be the discount.
All right, we have one more question that come in and then we'll wrap up for this evening, and that is how to factor the risk of fire on timber value.
One way you can do it, you might not want to do it yourselves as landowners, but so when you have a timber sale, we have those cash flows out at the end. You could multiply those by a percent. So if you think that there's a 20% chance of that happening, and you were going to get $1,000 for a timber sale, okay, well now maybe we just say we'll get 800 because there's a chance of loss that goes on there, and you can play with those numbers as much as you want. So instead of changing your discount rate around, you can actually go into your individual activities and just multiply your cash flows by, however much risk you think there is. If it's a 50% chance of it, getting wiped out, then you take 1,000 and multiply it by 0.5 and get 500. So now the expected return is 500 because I think there might be a fire. Does it still make sense to invest in this particular vehicle?
All right. Well, I'd like to take this time now to wrap things up and thank our presenters for taking the time to pull this presentation together and give it today. Thank you guys very much for your time in doing that. Also, our site hosts, thank you guys for taking the time to open up your facilities and having landowners come join us and participate. We appreciate it very much. As I indicated, we will get these resources that were talked about tonight. They will be put up on forestrywebinars.net for tonight's session, as well as we will get them on the Woodland Steward page. Site host, I ask that you remember to pass out your evaluations for the landowners. We do use this information to build our programs and to make sure that they are meeting your needs. So thank you very much and good night.